Hi, I'm Instructable's user Mongpuvian, and I'm here today to show you how to make your own chocolate in your own kitchen from scratch. Alright, to start off on the equipment side, what you're going to need is all laid out over here. You'll need a small food processor or spice grinder. I have a blade grinder, not a burr grinder. Cocoa will clog up a burr grinder very easily. You'll want a kitchen scale, a molcajete, which is a Mexican traditional implement used for making chocolate, or a traditional mortar and pestle, a small pan for roasting, a bowl of some kind, and over here you can see if you want to temper the chocolate yourself, you're also going to need a marble slab. Just a small one will do, but that's an optional step and you can skip it if you want. For the ingredients, much simpler. You'll need cocoa beans, preferably ones that are unroasted, and sugar. And if you wish, you can add spices or other flavorings to the chocolate when you make it. So here I've laid out some cinnamon and some nutmeg, so little fresh nutmegs here, and some coriander. But since you're making your own chocolate from scratch, pretty much the sky's the limit as far as what you can put in there. I've heard that cardamom is pretty good. You can add in bacon bits, really just anything that you might want. Okay, so for the first step, preheat your oven to 400 degrees. While that's preheating, you want to measure out your cocoa beans. So we can use the term measure a little bit loosely here, because you only need to really measure out enough cocoa beans to fit in a uniform layer in your pan. But I like to measure it because I'm a scientist in my day job and it's just a hard habit to break. So I find that batches of about 100 to 115 grams usually fit pretty well in my tiny little spice grinder. So here we have 117 grams of cocoa beans, so we can just move the scale and transfer these to our roasting pan. You just want to make sure that these fit in a nice even layer of one cocoa bean thick in your pan. Once the oven is hot, open it up and put in your cocoa beans. So we're going to do a two-stage roast for these beans. The first stage is going to be a short amount of time at a higher temperature, and what this will do is it'll help encourage the inside of the bean, the nib part, to separate from the outer shell. This will make the next step, winnowing the husks away from the beans, much easier if we do it properly. We can't let the whole roast happen at a higher temperature like that because cocoa beans are much more delicate than coffee beans, for instance. So if we let it go at 425 for 20 minutes, the beans would end up unpalatably dark and burnt tasting. So first step, high temperature to separate the shells. Second step, a lower temperature to develop the chocolatey flavors. Alright, so what we need to do now is we need to take the beans that we've just roasted and separate the husks from the nibs, which are the desirable part inside the bean. Now there's two ways to do this. You can either take the beans and peel them individually, so you just crack the husks off like that and extract the core of the bean. So this method has the advantage of giving you a nice large solid piece to work with, but the disadvantage is that it's rather slow and time consuming. A much faster way to do this is sort of by mimicking the way that industry actually separates the hulls from their beans. So if you want to do it the fast way, get yourself a plastic bag and transfer the cocoa beans into it. So just put them all in there. It's okay if you lose a few. Alright, seal up the bag. Place it on a hard surface. It doesn't have to be a cutting board, but I find a cutting board is a useful hard surface to have around, so we'll use that. Get a rolling pin or other heavy object, anything will work, a book or a pot or a pan, and then you want to thoroughly crush all of the beans inside the plastic bag. So you really just want to make sure that you've broken apart every single bean that's in the bag. If you find a couple stragglers, just get them with the end of the rolling pin. Alright, looks good. Now it's time to winnow the hulls away from the nibs. Industrially, this is done by blowing air over the nibs and the hulls, which separates the hulls out because they're lighter. At home you can do this with a bowl. Here I've got my bowl with my nibs and my hulls. this hand I've got a hairdryer with which to blow some air on this. You'll also notice that, first off, I'm outside now. This creates a colossal mess, so you do not want to do this indoors. And I would also recommend a pair of safety goggles. Again, the goggles aren't required, they're optional, but if you've had a bunch of cocoa hulls blown into your face once, you'll probably want to wear the goggles the next time you do this. So all we got to do, blow the hairdryer into the bowl and toss it gently so that we can separate out the lighter parts from the heavier. Alright, and when you're no longer just blowing stuff out of the bowl, you're just about done. So now we can move back inside. Now we're ready to make chocolate. Take your winnowed nibs and a little bit of sugar and your food processor all together. Now I want to make about a 70% chocolate, so in here I have 70 grams of nibs and in here I have 30 grams of sugar. First off, put the sugar in the food processor and process it until it is super fine. This doesn't really take too long. Next, put the nibs in on top of that. And start grinding. So at first, you'll create this mixture that kind of has the texture and consistency of coffee grounds. You want to keep going. And occasionally you need to scrape down the sides so that you get all the little bits that are stuck into the blades. You want to make sure that it all gets intimately mixed in there. So what I've done here is I've taken some of the mix out so as to not overtax my poor spice grinder, and to show you sort of the consistency that you're going to be aiming for as it continues to blend down. So you can see it's moved from something like coffee grounds to almost rich, like mud substance. So this is where you really need to start scraping down the bottom to get out the stuff that's stuck underneath the blades. When you do, you'll see that it's starting to appear wet and liquidy. This is the cocoa butter that's starting to squeeze out of the grounds. So we can just continue to grind this a little more until it starts to get more fluid. So you can see here now we're getting much closer to our finished product. So it's almost a thick paste now. It's gotten sort of out of the mud stage and closer to the wet clay stage. These are technical terms, mind you. If you poke it around with your spatula, you see that the mass is starting to become more sort of consistent, but we can still see that it's quite grainy to the naked eye. So we're going to need to continue grinding it until it no longer looks rough to us on the outside. So you'll notice now how the chocolate is almost smooth. There's still some graininess to it, but it is clearly liquid. So at this point, my poor, cheap spice grinder seems to be conking out, and it's not really refining it anymore because it's too thick. So if that's the case, or you just want to thin the chocolate down a little bit so that you have a thinner, more easy to work with product, you can do this by adding a little bit of cocoa butter. This is an optional step. Not everyone likes to add cocoa butter to their chocolate, but if you do, you can find cocoa butter as solid just at health food stores and the like, and you can just spoon a little bit into the warm chocolate. It'll melt in and it'll thin it up quite nicely. So in general, you don't want to add more than about 10 or 15% of the total weight of your chocolate in cocoa butter, but a little bit won't hurt. Alright, now that the chocolate is as liquid as it's going to get, you can see it's nice and fluid now. Still a little grainy, but sometimes that can't be helped. We're ready to do the next step, which is to conch it. Conching is a process by which we take the chocolate and we put it into a device like this molcajete and then grind it around for a while to coat all of the cocoa fat particles, all of the cocoa solids with fat, and help develop some more of that chocolatey flavor. So take your raw chocolate now and put it into the mortar and pestle or molcajete. Now this has been warmed in the oven just for a few minutes so that the chocolate won't solidify or seize up on us. Just transfer it all out. Okay, and now what you do is simple enough. Just use the molcajete or mortar and pestle as it was intended and grind the chocolate around. Just do this until your arm gets tired. The more, the better, but even a little bit will help. So you might be wondering to yourself, when am I done with conching? And the best answer is, you're done when you're done. The purpose of this is to drive out a lot of the volatile, sort of harsh chemicals that give chocolate off flavors. So the best way to find out is just to taste your chocolate and to see if you like it. And I do. Once the chocolate meets with your high standards, you're ready for tempering it if you so choose. Tempering increases the shelf life and stability of the chocolate, so I would highly recommend it. So if you're going to temper it, get out your marble slab, and you're also going to need some form of scraping tool. I use these two paint scrapers that I got at the local hardware store. Tempering when done by this method is called tabling. Now the option that you see most often on the internet and even on Instructables is seeding. So if you wish to avoid the mess and the hassle that's associated with tabling the chocolate, you can also temper it by seeding, in which case you take a small amount of seeded tempered chocolate, melt it, and then mix it in with your batch. But since we're trying to make this from scratch, it seems like a shame to contaminate it with commercial chocolate. If you want to, you can also leave it untempered. That'll change the mouthfeel and the flavor a little bit, but it'll still be tasty chocolate. So at this point, if you didn't want to temper it, you could just pour it into some shells or molds and save it as is. Alright, to table the chocolate, if we had a large batch, you'd want to do a little bit on the table and then return it to the main batch after it's been seeded. But since we have such a small amount, we can just do it, the whole batch, on this marble slab here. So what you want to do is just pour it out on the slab and continually agitate it with the scrapers to stop large chunks from forming. Now the type of seed crystal that you need to form here is created by agitation. So you don't need to worry too much about the chocolate forming other types of crystals if you just keep it moving while it's on the table. Eventually it'll start to thicken up and crystallize, and then that's when you're going to be done. Alright, so you can see now here that the chocolate is solidified quite a bit. You might be thinking to yourself, what if this doesn't work? What if the chocolate goes out of temper? Is this fixable? Of course it's fixable. Tempering is a reversible process. So worst case scenario, the chocolate isn't tempered properly, it blooms upon storage, and then you just have to remelt it and temper it again. If it is out of temper, just make sure that when you do go to retemper it, you heat the whole batch up to at least 122 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the temperature at which all forms of cocoa butter crystals melt. So once it starts to thicken, you can check to see if it's in temper. There's a couple ways to do this. One is to put the chocolate on your lip. Cocoa butter actually cools as it solidifies, so sometimes you can feel the temperature difference. Another way is to put a small amount of chocolate on a knife. This works, of course, if the chocolate is thinner, and draw your finger through it rapidly. Now, if it leaves a clear spot like that, then it's more likely that the chocolate is properly in temper. So now, we can either move this into molds, or let it solidify on the slab as is, and then break it up when we want to eat it. So I'm just going to leave this on the slab, let it solidify, and we can come back in a few minutes and see if it blooms at all to verify that it is actually in temper. So now, after letting the chocolate sit for a few minutes, you can see here it breaks up into nice even chunks, and there's no sign of white streaks, which would indicate fat bloom, which would indicate that the chocolate's out of temper. So now that it's done, feel free to break off a piece and enjoy.